So can we start now, sir?
What is the topic today? এটা কৌশিকের টপিক নাকি?
এটা স্যার দুজনেরই। Topic হলো security of things and the low cost authenticated interaction in the world of IoT. স্যার বলবেন, দেবদীপ স্যার। Okay. So start করবো স্যার?
Yes.
Frame, we are starting, okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very good evening to our august audience and our respected panel members. We welcome you all to today's webinar organized by the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad University of Technology, West Bengal. I am Kaushik Majumdar from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering of this university. Today, we are privileged to have amongst us our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Shoykat Moitro, Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, who will be enlightening us today with his keynote speech on security of things and their low-cost authenticated interaction in the world of IoT. And we also have Dr. Shoykat Moitro from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering of this university. First of all, we'd like to express our sincere thanks to our respected panel members for taking time out of their busy schedule to be here. We believe that this is going to be a great learning opportunity for our audience. Now, before we begin, may I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor Shoykat Moitro, to please inaugurate the program and illuminate us with your valuable words, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar. Already I can see 90 participants have joined. So this is a good sign that there is enough interest for this topic. Today, Dr. Devdeep Mukhopadhyay from IIT Kharagpur, he will be delivering the talk. It's also a great thing that from a premier institute, IIT Kharagpur, one of the front-runner scientists in this field, he will be delivering this talk. And then all this, we have a certain interest in this area because we have our computer science department, our microelectronics, VLSIs, and all these related areas. There can be large numbers of, and also we have such programs at different affiliated colleges. Now, this is the time where we would like to spend, this more focus in research areas, because most of these learning things, as far as the subjects are concerned, that can happen by a mode of self-learning. So this research will be the most prominent activity in all the campuses in near future, because this will be the one of the way for upgrading the concept and upgrading the learning ability, upgrading the, we can call the ability to develop further knowledge, which is some sort of, these presumptions that amongst all our, these learners. So in that way, this is a very important and interesting topic. And this costing is one of the determining factor for widespread applications of all these devices related to securities and all these things. For our country, what we are foreseeing, that in near future, there will be emergence of a massive entrepreneurship because of this geopolitical rearrangement. We may not be able to import a lot of things from other countries. Therefore, this is the right time to upgrade our capability in that direction. So a strong foundation of research and translation of this research into commercial propositions for encouraging entrepreneurship, that should be one of the important the aspect of our education systems in near future. And in that direction, we have started works, and this is good to see that our faculty members, they are taking active interest in collaboration and integrations with different research institute, different researchers. And hopefully out of all these activities, we will be in a position to generate more numbers of researchers, a research group, and from their activities, there will be further development of knowledge and further development of economy simultaneously. So with this expectation, I would like to express my sincerest thanks to Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay. And I believe that all the participants, they'll be immensely benefited from his presentation and deliberation. And of course, if you have any interest for further knowing about this subject, there is discussion forum. You can always post your queries and all these things at discussion forums, and there will be an opportunity for this peer-to-peer collaborations amongst you, and maybe a collaboration and maybe some these advices from all these experts like Dr. Kaushik Mujumdar, Dr. Shoikat Basu, Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay. So in that way, we the ecosystems, knowledge-based, this group and knowledge-based community will be developed. This is our expectation, and you kindly all this part. This is my advice to all the participants: take active interest, because you see, if you stay behind the screen and get yourself this engaged in only listening without applying your mind, then after some times your interest level will be dropped. So take one piece of paper, take notes of important points whichever is being this discussed or being presented, and try to find out in your own way the significance and meanings of all these things. Try to put your questions and queries. Make this learning process effective. Maybe it will be continuing for 1 hour, but try to utilize this 1 hour for gainful learning of these subjects. Then our purpose of organizing these webinars will be this achieved. And afterwards, the certification, all these things, that is the normal procedure, routine procedure, that will be there always. But my appeal and request to all of you is engage yourselves in active mode of learning and try to learn as much as possible from today's discussion. And I believe that Dr. Mujumdar and Dr. Basu and Professor Mukhopadhyay, Devdeep Mukhopadhyay, will be presenting a very interesting and illuminating thing. Take the benefit of all these things. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable words. May I now request Dr. Shoikat Basu to introduce our honorable speaker, Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay.
Thank you, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, and thank you, Professor Mukhopadhyay, and thank you, Dr. Kaushik Mujumdar, to give me a chance to tell that. And Dr. Devdeep Mukhopadhyay, no need to have any telling anything. So, but I have to tell something about him. Dr. Devdeep Mukhopadhyay is currently a full professor at the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, IIT Kharagpur. At IIT Kharagpur, he initiated the Secured Embedded Architecture Laboratory, SEAL, with focus on embedded security and side channel attacks. Prior to this, he worked as an assistant professor at IIT Kharagpur and visiting scientist at several institutes like NTU Singapore, a visiting associate professor at NIU Shanghai, assistant professor at IIT Madras, and visiting researcher at NYU Tandon School of Engineering, USA. He holds a PhD and MS and BTech all from IIT Kharagpur, India. Dr. Mukhopadhyay's research interests are cryptography, hardware security, and VLSI. His books include Fault Tolerance Architecture for Cryptography and Hardware Security, published by Springer, Cryptography and Network Security by McGraw-Hill's, Hardware Security Design and Threats and Safeguards by CRC Press, and Timing Challenge in Cryptography by Springer. He has written more than 150 papers in peer-reviewed conferences and journals, and has collaborated with several Indian and foreign organizations. He has been in the program committee of several top international conferences and is an associate editor of International Association of Cryptographic Research, IACR, transaction of CHES, IEEE transaction on information forensics and security, IEEE TIFS, ACMT transaction on embedded computing system, ACM TECS, ACM Journal of Embedding Technologies in Computer System, ACM JETC, Journal of Hardware and System Security, Journal of Cryptographic Engineering, Springer. He has been several invited talks in industry and academia, including tutorial talks at premier conferences like CHES, IAFS, VLSID. Dr. Mukhopadhyay is recipient of the prestigious Swarna Jayanti DST Fellowship in the year of 2015 and 2016. Data Security Council of India Award for Cyber Security Education, Young Scientist Award from the Indian National Science Academy, the Young Engineer Award from the Indian National Academy of Engineering, and Young Association of Indian Academy of Science. He was also awarded the Outstanding Young Faculty Fellowship in the year of 2011 from IIT Kharagpur, and the Techno inventor-based PhD award by the Indian Semiconductor Association. He has recently incubated a startup on hardware security named ESP Private Limited at IIT Kharagpur. So now we'll have that some title and the abstract with his talk. So in title will be security of things and their low cost authenticated interaction in the world of IoT. With the advent of the Internet of Things, the need of challenges of security have increased manifold. While the things of the IoT have to be secured against adversaries and the fortified by conventional cryptography, there are the hotbeds of the growingly menacing side channel attacks which targets weakness in implementation. On the other hand, cost is a major constraint for many of these devices, and hence IoT devices are routinely being sold and proprietary authentication and security mechanism, which can be subverted quite easily. This motivates the study of unconventional secure authentication and key establishment protocol using novel architecture primitives called physically unclonable functions, PUF. In this talk, uh, Professor Mukhopadhyay will summarize research direction of Secure Embedded Architecture Laboratories, SEAL, IIT Kharagpur, India, in the broad area of hardware security. Subsequently, he will present an overview on side channel attacks. These vulnerabilities can be potentially used by skilled adversaries to compromise trusted executions, which are considered to be base of various emerging application like automotive. Finally, we will present an overview of PUFs and their usage in developing low-cost authentication suitable for IoT innovation. In particular, he will present designs being developed in SEAL using PUF-based authentication, which can also lead to key establishment without the need of public key infrastructure, which are major bottleneck for IoTs. Now I kindly request Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay to share his screen and share his experience. Sir, please.
So thank you all for this kind invitation, and also I hope I'm audible, right? So I would like to first of all thank you all for this kind invitation, and let me try to share the screen. It works. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
So yeah, so this talk, as we have already heard, is entitled as security of things and their low cost authenticated interaction in the world of IoT. So in this work, in this talk, I will be trying to give a perspective of, like the security of emerging Internet of Things. And I will be also talking about, like security in the things, because many of the things that are around us are proposed to be interconnected in this world of IoT, which brings us a lot of opportunity, but at the same time also brings us a lot of like attack surfaces which we need to kind of consider in order to develop a secured end-to-end system. So what we basically see is so in my talk I will be trying to first start with introducing my group, which we call as Secured Embedded Architecture Lab, or SEAL, and then I shall be talking about these two aspects of Internet of Things and side channel analysis. Now, side channel analysis is a pretty broad topic, so I will be trying to focus on two important attack vectors. One of them is what is called as the power side channel, and the second is what is called as fault attacks. So these are the two attack vectors that I will be trying to consider in depth in my talk. And finally, we will be talking about like authentication of the devices which are there in Internet of Things or IoT. But I will be trying to emphasize that, taking some examples of commercial IoT devices, that they are not often amenable to standard or classical crypto protocols because of the fact of cost, because of which they have in-house authentication mechanisms, which can be often targeted by attackers. So with this, I will be trying to kind of propose, like a very promising hardware security primitive, which is called as physically unclonable functions, or PUFs, and try to see how they can be utilized to develop an end-to-end lightweight authentication for the IoT devices. So in order to start this discussion, I will be trying to, like mention that when we talk about embedded security, like the type of work that we essentially are doing in our institute, tries to address the gap between theory and practice. So what I mean is that if you take any standard classical cryptographic book, you will be seeing that there are two communicators. Like there is an at one end there is Alice, the other end we have got Bob, and they are legitimate parties who are involved in any communication. We that the communication channel through which the message is being transferred from the sender to the receiver is untrusted. That means the adversary has got access to the communication channel. So what we have, mathematically is essentially at this point, this is the picture that we have. However, we all know that cryptographic theory has limitations, because of which even strong or mathematically strong ciphers can leak in the real world. So how do they leak information in the real world? They leak by something which we called as side channels. So side channels are, like unintended communication channels through which information, or through which a cryptographic module leaks information to its environment in an unintentional fashion. So let me give an example to illustrate this point. This is a kind of, you can say, a fun exercise that we try to do in our laboratory. So this is on the top left of my screen, you can see that there is a locker. And this locker, believe me, is a commercially deployed locker, and we have just bought it fresh from the market. We have obscured the name for the sake of privacy of the company. So typically this locker has got a 6-digit PIN. Okay, so if I ask you randomly what is the PIN, then you would probably require something like 10 to the power of 6 trials to tell what is the actual PIN. Okay, so if you remove out 0, maybe 1 less, but roughly that is the order of key conjuring or key guesses that you need to do in order to know what is the correct PIN. But in reality, things can be completely different. So we tried a very simple experiment. We tried to keep the locker intact and open the in front part of this locker. And we found out that there are two endpoints in this apparatus. So there is a reset pin and there is a ground pin. The idea being that if you can kind of, short these 2 points, then the pin gets, the pin gets zeroized. Okay. And that implies that after you have shorted the reset pin and the ground pin, then the pin being zeroized, you just need to enter 6 zeros to open the lock. Okay. So this is a very simple example, but I just wanted to tell you, like this is an example to illustrate that the designer of the crypto system or the secured system has a completely different objective, but what he ends up is completely different from what his objective was. And that gives us, like an sort of a lesson that it is not only important to have a, like a mathematically secure crypto algorithm or maybe a secure protocol, but you also need to implement it in a proper fashion so that you achieve what is called as an end-to-end security. So with this objective, I think for the last 12 years, we are running this lab in our department, which we call as Secured Embedded Architecture Lab, abbreviated as SEAL. And it has got nothing to do, believe me, with what is called as the US Navy SEALs. It is just an abbreviation which coincides with the SEAL abbreviation. And we have got, like we have graduated, I think almost right now 9 PhD students who are working in different places. Some of them are also faculty members in other IITs and other places in the world, like some of them are working in Intel US and so on. So, and we also have got several postdoctoral fellows who are working, like constantly to find out different attacks and also their suitable countermeasures. So, of course, like in order to, like bring in life to our research, we also need, like sophisticated apparatus or instruments to perform side channel evaluation, IoT security, or I would say IoT insecurity analysis, CPS or cyber physical system security, and in particular hardware forensic. So we have a complete end-to-end lab, which we are continuously uplifting and trying to develop and make it state of the art in order to like work on these various experimental aspects. So with this background, let me start the main technical aspect or technical part of today's presentation. So we all know that Internet of Things or IoT are promised as next generation networks, which is promised to extend today's network or internet much beyond than what is today. It is believed that there will be billions of devices which are connected, and they're already getting connected. And it gives us huge potentials in terms of, like revolutionizing the quality of life. However, the point that I will try to emphasize is that IoT devices lack security measures, and this can have catastrophic consequences to mankind. So on the positive side, I would say IoT is, even in the Indian context, right, has got several promises. It can, help us to have good amount of water control, food control, e-governance, pharmaceuticals, and maybe, even in the world of COVID, there may be, like several opportunities that IoT can provide. We are seeing that it is equally important to understand how to run a world on an online basis. Okay, that is how we are probably running this presentation right now. Okay, so it is important to have these mechanisms, but it is also equally important to ensure that security is, is inbuilt in these mechanisms, and they have to be inbuilt from the very first start of the design phase. Okay, so security can never be an afterthought because it doesn't work in that way. So how do we, really protect our systems against menacing threats is what we need to strive for. So let me give an example. This was a paper which was published in a very top security conference, probably one of the top among top 3, which is called as IEEE Symposium on Security and Privacy. And this was published in 2017 by an Israeli group, which shows, which is titled as IoT Goes Nuclear. So let me try to give an example or a little bit illustration behind this work. So what they essentially targeted are something which are very popular in the IoT industry, or maybe among the first few products that were developed. So this is called as a Philips Hue lighting system, which is basically nothing but like a bunch of smart bulbs. So what are smart bulbs? Smart bulbs are of course bulbs, but along with it, they have a smartness, as their name suggests, which means you can whitelist yourself, you can authenticate yourself, and as an owner of the bulb, you have the power or privilege to control and command those bulb lights so that you can set the ambience of your house or your apartment or your of your company premises, depending upon the mood that you have. Okay, so it is a very nice setup that you can have probably for your premise. So what they targeted, or the attackers targeted, was this lighting system, because there is an authentication inbuilt in these IoT devices, and they are pretty low cost in terms of their commercial prices. So what the attackers found out in a very nutshell, so the idea is that if you have got a smart bulb, then those smart bulbs, right, has got something which is called as a proximity checker. So that means that you cannot control these bulbs from a very far distance or from a very far distance apart. So now this proximity checker, if you really want to bypass, then you have to basically upgrade its or modify its firmware so that this proximity checker is bypassed. Okay, but you cannot do that upfront because you cannot simply install any firmware to operate in the hardware of these bulbs. Okay, because if you do that, then there is a MAC check which is being done, as you can see in this diagram. Roughly what it says is that there is an inbuilt key in these bulbs. So there is maybe a 128-bit secret key which is there in these bulbs, and you ideally should not be able to kind of you should not be able to kind of install any firmware, because its authentication check will fail because you do not know the underlying, say, 128-bit secret key. But having said that, I mean, that what the attackers try to do, the attackers try to do something which is called as a physical side channel attack. So what they did is they took this bulb, and when this bulb is operating, so maybe one of these bulbs from this building, and when it's operating, that is when it is performing its authentication check, maybe, so there is an underlying cryptographic operation which is being done. At that time, the attacker tries to capture the the power traces during the computation. So it could be the power trace or maybe the electromagnetic traces which are there during this computation. So now there is a technique which I will try to illustrate in my presentation, which is called as CPA or correlation power analysis, through which they try to do a statistical analysis which helps them to infer the 128-bit secret key. Now, once they inferred the 128-bit secret key, then they found out another interesting observation, which is that maybe because of the sake of convenience, they found that all of the bulbs which were installed in, like a company premise were essentially having the same 128-bit secret key, okay? Because maybe for the sake of convenience, because you can imagine that if every bulb has got a different key, then it also requires a lot of, like key management and other things, which probably are difficult to perform in this kind of setup. So, but the attackers found out therefore that a side channel attack was able to kind of recover the 128-bit key and was eventually able to kind of update their firmware where the proximity check is bypassed. And then they did a very interesting demonstration of an attack where they kind of released a, like a self-spreading worm. So worm is essentially a usual term which is used for malware. The idea being is that what they did is they took complete, like ownership or possess these bulbs, and they try to kind of display an SOS bulb. Okay, so the SOS signal in this bulb. So therefore, you can imagine they probably if you're interested, they gave a very interesting demonstration where they try to kind of like show that these bulbs are completely possessed and they are displaying this SOS signal, which shows that they are completely being kind of like captured by the adversary. So this is a simple demonstration to show that a physical side channel attack can be quite catastrophic, and they demonstrated that like one initially maybe one bulb is one IoT device is captured and compromised, and that leads to more, and that leads to many more, and that's why the term which they say as IoT goes nuclear. There is a kind of like a catastrophic consequence of IoT devices falling to the prey to the adversary. So therefore, right, we need to kind of stop these kind of attacks, and therefore it is not only important to implement maybe the AES which is there, or the advanced encryption standard which is there in these systems, but also we need to ensure that those cryptographic algorithms are properly implemented such that these kind of physical attacks do not take place or do not work. So we need countermeasures. So that brings us to this comment which says that strong cryptographic algorithms are just the beginning. Okay, so the strong cryptographic algorithms are just the beginning, and what we need is not only to have like a strong cryptographic, or of course that is a very important starting point, but we also need to ensure that they are properly implemented. So what I mean is that if you take maybe like a very strong cryptographic algorithm like say RSA, and you have a smart card and you have a secret key which you are trying to protect, and you have got a card accepting device. So if you do a normal exchange of data, that means your input and output, then your mathematically strong cryptographic algorithm would be able to secure your secret because of certain mathematical guarantees. But what may happen in a real world is while you are doing this transaction, you are actually revealing information of what is called as the power consumption, and that power consumption can maybe trivially like open up the key or open up the secret key. So therefore, we need to ensure that such kind of attacks, which are called as, like falls into the class of what are called as side channel attacks, should not work in the real world. So therefore, this brings us to this question, what are side channels? So side channels are, I would say, like covert channels or secret channels through which information is leaked, which the designer of the cryptographic algorithm did not consider, okay? And you may be surprised to know that information will be often, like compromised or leaked because of optimizations. So we all know that when we have an algorithm and when we would like to implement an algorithm, then we do optimizations, okay? And these optimizations, for example, could be something like an if-else statement, where the if-else essentially is conditioned on a secret data or a data which is derived from a secret data, which could be your secret key as well. So these kind of optimizations, we can often leak information, and that can be potential reasons of what are called as side channel attacks. So here is a very simple illustration of an experimental setup that we have at IIT KGP. So in particular, I'm trying to showcase what we call as the power side channel setup. So we have got the oscilloscope say at one end, and we have got a PC or like a computer, and it could be even a mobile device on which you are executing your encryption algorithm. And while it is so the idea is that you can actually, so the PC essentially is your main computing power for and you can think of as the PC is your adversary. Okay, and then you have got maybe an FPGA board, or it could be any hardware for that matter. It could be even a target mobile phone for that matter, where you are running or executing an encryption system. So it could be any encryption system. For example, it could be AES, it could be DES, it could be RSA, it could be 3DS, and so on and so on. And while it is executing, you can see that there is a current probe. The idea of the current probe being that it is basically observing the power consumption of the device. Okay, so it can be either invasive or it can be non-invasive. For example, you can try to monitor the electromagnetic radiations around this device, and you can amplify that signal and you store it in your oscilloscope. Now the oscilloscope takes this data, which is often called as a trace, and this trace is communicated to your PC. So the PC is the adversary which sends an input data. It observes the ciphertext, but along with its normal input and output, which are called as the plain text and the ciphertext, it also observes the traces, which is like the power traces or the EM traces. So now what the attacker tries to do is the attacker tries to develop a statistical technique through which it can get the real secret key. So that is the 120-bit secret key, which maybe your underlying encryption algorithm is utilizing for doing encryption or decryption. So here are some real life snapshots of the devices. So therefore, when we talk about side channel attacks, typically there are two types of classes that we have in side channel attacks. One, which is called as simple power analysis. In simple power analysis, we exploit the fact that the power consumption at an instance of time is a function of the operation being carried out by the device. So the underlying operation essentially has got a footprint on the power consumption, and the power consumption depends upon what operation it is being doing. For example, if there is a multiplication operation and there is maybe a squaring operation, then the power consumption of doing a squaring is different from that of doing a multiplication. So how can that reveal information about the secret? You may be curious to know. So let me give an example. So remember, like if you take any standard cryptographic book, then a very popular like crypto system is what is called as an RSA crypto system, which was due to three great cryptographers, Rivesh, Shamir, and Edelman. So what they basically gave in a very nutshell is an algorithm which is as simple as you take an input, say the cipher, which is say Y, and you have a decryption exponent. Let me denote it as D. So what you just do is Y power of D modulo, which is modulo is nothing but you kind of divide and note the remainder. So you basically do a modulo with some number n. Okay, so now this n is a public information. That means everybody knows the value of n. So everybody knows the value of the cipher, the Y. Everybody knows the value of the value n. But what everybody does not know is the secret key. That means that you can think of something like a secret password or so on, which is denoted as D. So you are doing this. So when your hardware, so it could be your smart card, for example, or credit card, for example, when it is doing a computation like Y power of D modulo n, note that you are able to observe the output, but you do not know what is the secret key inside. Okay, the secret key is say D. But if as an adversary, if you are able to observe the power consumption or the EM radiation around it, then you need to also understand that whether the power consumption is kind of constant or whether it varies with the underlying operations. Okay, so this is the fact which is exploited by simple side channel attacks, which says that when you want to implement Y power of D, a naive way would be say I will take Y and I will multiply it D times, but that is not normally done. So you do an optimization, because as I said that optimizations are very important, because you need to at the end of the day develop an efficient system which works in real life or real time. So what you do is you basically employ a very classical or conventional algorithm, which is called as the square and multiply algorithm. So what you do is you take D, you expand D as a binary sequence of zeros and ones, and you always do a squaring operation. And whenever you see a binary value or the binary bit being 1, you do a conditional multiplication. So you multiply with Y. So you can check this as your leisure. This will give you exactly y power of d. So now when you are engaging or implementing this algorithm, you know that you are doing two operations. One is you are doing a squaring, which is always, but you are also doing a multiplication, but you are not doing the multiplication always. You are doing the multiplication only at times when your secret key bit is 1. Okay. So that means if the attacker is able to observe the power consumption, and if the power consumption for squaring and for multiplication are different, then just by observing the power consumption, and of course by doing suitable statistical analysis, you will be able to understand whether the secret key bit was 1 or whether it was 0. So that is the basic idea behind how simple power attacks work. Of course, there are more sophistications, but this is a very, I would say, a high level depiction of this kind of attacks. However, there are several ways in which you can prevent against these attacks. For example, a naive way would be, let me always do a square and multiplication. So I will always do a multiplication, maybe on a dummy variable. And that way I will kind of blunt the power attack, so that, or the sidechain attack, so that since you are doing always this operation, the previous attack should not work. But then there is an even more powerful attack, which is called as a differential sidechain attack, or differential power analysis in our context, which exploits something even more fundamental. So this exploits the fact that power consumption of the same operation at different instants of time actually depends upon the underlying data which is being processed. So that means, like, whether you are processing on a 1 or whether you are processing on a 0, that essentially also has got a footprint on the power consumption. So that way, even if you are, like, ensuring that a multiplication is always being done, but if imagine that the power consumption reveals information about the internal registers or the internal bits which are being processed by these computations, then the entire security collapses. Okay. And because you are giving internal information which the designer of the mathematically strong crypto algorithm never wanted to do. And that was the basis of a very strong paper which was published in a very premier conference in cryptography, which is called as Crypto in 1999 by a gentleman called Paul Kocher and his colleagues. And they showed that differential power analysis can be a very powerful attack vector. So that essentially is kind of, I would say, the background behind SPA and DPA, as they are often abbreviated, simple power attacks and differential power attacks. And SPA typically works on what are called as the power consumption traces. And the traces are nothing but a set of power consumptions across a cryptographic process. So you can imagine that suppose there is a cryptographic operation which is being done, and when you're observing the power consumption, you try to sample that at a, like a given frequency, maybe say 5 megahertz, for example, and then that will yield or give you a trace which probably has some number of points. So maybe n number of points, say n equal to 5,000, so 5,000 points. So this is what is called as a trace. So let me give a visual depiction of how a power trace will look like. So you can see on the left, I show you a power trace, which is of the power trace of a very popular encryption algorithm, which is called as the advanced encryption standard. So this is a very popular algorithm which is used worldwide. Maybe all of you, right? If you are using a smart card or something like, or maybe a mobile phone, you are using AES in one form or the other. So it is as popular as that. Okay. So you can see now that the power consumption is giving you some information, but probably not the secret key. For example, you can, if you're curious, you can try to count the number of edges that are there in this power trace, and you will see that there are 10 such edges. Okay, and these edges are actually corresponding to the internal rounds or internal, what we call as internal, like set of operations which are repeated over time. And these are called as rounds. And the AES 128, if you see the algorithm of AES 128, it has got 10 rounds. And if you count this number of edges, you will also see 10. So that is I would say in one form, like some form of information which is being revealed by the power trace itself. If you zoom in further, say inside one round, you will see that, as you can see on the right, you will see some more variations. And you can see that, for example, with little bit of more observation, you can see that the first part of the trace is what are called as the nonlinear part of the algorithm. They're called as S boxes or substitution boxes, followed by some other parts of the internal round. So the power trace of an AES, you can see, if you observe minutely, you will see variations. And these variations occur because of the fact that the operation depends on power, which will lead to an SPA. But the variation also occurs because of the dependence of power on the underlying data. And that is what makes these kind of simple designs susceptible to what are called as differential power attacks or differential power analysis. So let me try to, give you some pictographic depiction of how the DES works, or how the DPA works. So let us take, for example, DES. Okay, so DES, as you know, has a 56-bit key, and this attack shows you that you can actually recover the key in a, like in a fragment by fragment way or manner. So for example, with 4,000 power traces, you can see here that I'm just trying to retrieve a part of the key, and that way you can recover the key using a divide and conquer manner. So for example, in this case, what we try to show that if the correct key nibble is 4-1, and that is revealed here. Okay, so you can see that there are distinguishable spikes that are making it distinct from the remaining parts of the keys. Okay, so of course, like that way you can see that even for triple DES or maybe AES, all of them are vulnerable to this class of attack. So then let me try to give an explanation of how or what is the basic working principle of what are called as CPA, which is a class of differential power attack. Okay, so this is a very simple illustration of correlation power attack. So consider that you have got an encryption algorithm, and the encryption algorithm starts with inputs. So these inputs for the encryption algorithms are called as the plain text, whereas if you have a decryptor or decryption algorithm, then the input would be the ciphertext. So the nomenclature is that you take an input which is called as the plain text, you encrypt it, and you get the cipher. Okay, and if you want to decrypt, then you feed the cipher as an input, and then you get the output, which is the plain text. So this attack can work with both the plain text as well as the cipher. So let me illustrate. Suppose you have got a bunch of ciphertexts, and with the ciphertext you would like to obtain what is the secret key. So now what you do is as follows. You take maybe like several such ciphertexts. So maybe like 1,000 ciphertexts, and let me denote the 1,000 by this variable, say D. So there are D ciphertexts that you observe, and there are also the key hypothesis. So what is key hypothesis? So this attack, as I said, is a divide and conquer attack, which means you try to retrieve the key in a byte by byte fashion. Okay, so in AES 128, the total key size is 128 bits. So 128 bits is nothing but 16 bytes. Okay, so there are 16 independent bytes in the secret key, and I want to retrieve, say, the first byte of this key. Likewise, I can retrieve the second byte, third byte, and so on. I can engage a divide and conquer algorithm. And the first byte, therefore, right, can take certain number of values. As we know that a byte can take only 256 possible values because it is 2 to the power of 8, right? So it can take 2 to the power of 8, which is 256 values. And that 256 is shown here as K1 to KK. Okay, so big K stands here for the number of possibilities that we have for this key byte. So what I do is as follows. I take all the inputs, that is the ciphertext, and then I take my key hypothesis. So basically I make a guess for the key. Say I guess the key is K1 and my input is D1, and then I kind of like decrypt only the last round of the AES algorithm. Okay, so in the last round, if you observe the AES algorithm, you will see that, and you want to go back, you will see that there is a key XORing which is being done. That means you take D1, which is 1 byte, you take K1, which is 1 byte of the key. So D1 is 1 byte of the cipher, and K1 is 1 byte of the secret key, and you XOR them. So you do an exclusive OR between them, and then you basically like do an inverse operation of one step or one nonlinear step, which is called as the substitution box or the S box of the cipher. This is the most important, or one of the most important steps of the block cipher. And when you do that, you get what is called as a hypothetical intermediate value. Why it is hypothetical? Because this state may not be correct, because it depends upon the key hypothesis that you have done, which may be wrong because you have done a key guess, right? So what you do is you repeat this process for all the D operations, because there are D ciphers. So you repeat this operation for all the D possible ciphers, and therefore you will get something like V11, V21, and so on till VD1. So all of these, or the entire column, is basically based on your hypothesis that the key byte is K1. Likewise, you repeat this for your next key hypothesis, which is K2, and therefore you get again a bunch of intermediate values, which is say V12 to VD2. Okay, so note that both these columns cannot be simultaneously true. That means either this column is correct or this column is correct, or at least any one of the columns has to be correct, because there are, like in total, there are 256 possibilities, and all of this column stands for one of the possibilities. Okay. So now what you do is you apply, like a very popular powered model, which is there in VLSI technology. We often assume that the power consumption depends upon a powered model or can be predicted by a powered model. And that powered model could be as simple as that, maybe, like a Hamming weight powered model. So what is a Hamming weight powered model? It basically means the number of ones which you have in a byte. So then what you do is you apply the Hamming weight powered model to this column, say maybe V11 to VD1, and you get a hypothetical power column, which is H11 to HD1. And likewise, you repeat this process for all the columns of your intermediate hypothetical values. So now you get a matrix, which is what we call as the hypothetical powered matrix. Okay. So note that in this column, in this matrix, there are D rows, because each of these rows corresponds to the ciphertext that you have, or the cipher that you have. And each of the columns correspond to the key hypothesis that you have, the key guess that you have made. So now note that when you were doing this operation, that means when you were doing these D operations or D decryption operations, you also had stored the power trace. Okay. And all these power traces are stored in the form of what is called as a real powered matrix. Okay. So what is a real power matrix, or how does it look like? So you can see that there will be D rows, because each of these rows corresponds to one decryption operation. So for example, the first row is shown here as P11, P12, so on till P1T. That is one, like set up power trace. And likewise, there are D power traces that we are observed. Every power trace or each power trace is obtained at each decryption operation. But then remember that you have also sampled the power traces, which means that there are T instances at which you are observed the power traces, and that denotes the number of columns that you have. So this matrix runs from P11 to, so there are D rows and there are T columns in this matrix. But note that now comes the most important or interesting part of this attack. So note that, as I said, that in the hypothetical powered matrix, all of these or each of these columns or two columns cannot be simultaneously true. Okay, so out of these K columns, I mean, it cannot be that there are two columns which are true. Only one of them can be true, because that column essentially talks about the correct key hypothesis. Whereas, so now what we do is we take each of these columns, like suppose let me take the first column, H11, H21, so on till HD1. So this is the first column of your hypothetical powered matrix. And I start to do a simple correlation analysis where I start to try to correlate this vector with each of these columns in my powered matrix. Okay. So if my key hypothesis was correct, then there must be one column for which I will get a good amount of correlation, because that will show me that this hypothetical powered matrix essentially is correlating nicely with a given instance of time, okay, for my real powered matrix. However, if my key hypothesis was wrong, then the conjecture is that at any point of time, for any correlation that I do with any of the columns of this real powered matrix, I will not get any significant correlation. Okay. So what I therefore do is I take one column from the hypothetical power matrix, I take one column from the real power matrix, and let me denote this column say as I and the next column by J, and that basically gives me the ij element of this what we called as the correlation matrix. Okay, so the correlation matrix basically stores the correlation value, which could be simple, maybe a Pearson's correlation, which you observe between a column of the hypothetical power matrix and a column of the real power matrix. So the idea being that if you get a significant peak in this correlation matrix, then and you try to find out where is the maximum correlation, and that maximum correlation should tell you what is the key hypothesis which is correct, as opposed to the other ones which are wrong. Okay, so you can imagine that if there are 256 possible guesses for this key byte, then out of that only one key byte is correct, whereas 255 are wrong key guesses. Okay, and that way you should be able to distinguish the correct key hypothesis from the wrong ones. So that is the basic idea behind this attack, and it is essentially is a divide and conquer attack, which means that even if I am recovering say 1 byte of the key, in parallel I can recover all the 16 bytes of the key, and my guess or guess complexity will be 16 times the required amount of effort to get one of the key components or key bytes. So that way, even if I increase the number of key or the key length, right, will have got no effect on this complexity. And that is why it's a very powerful adversary and can recover, the key in a very realistic amount of time and effort. So here is again a more depiction of this, but basically this is what we have already discussed. So in order to kind of, develop a complete end-to-end system, so as well was mentioned is we have a startup or incubated at IIT Kharagpur, through which we have developed this tool, which is called as ESP Anveshak, which is a side channel evaluator and analyzer tool. It is a built on open source platform. It can perform power attacks and also a fault attack, which I will try to kind of tell in a few minutes later. And it is entirely built on Python, which therefore, and also it allows remote access, which is something through which we are able to still do our experiments, like when we are shut out of our laboratories because of this menacing COVID-19. So with this, let me come to the next part of the side channel discussion, which is what is called as DFA or differential fault attacks. Okay. So let me try to explain what DFA means. So DFA in this context means that suppose you have got an encryption algorithm and you take a plain text and you get a fault-free ciphertext. Next time when you are doing an encryption, you try to create a perturbation in the environment. So it could be something like a clock glitch, you try to make a voltage fluctuation, or you can also use more sophisticated techniques like what we try to do in our laboratory, like you take an EM gun or electromagnetic gun, you shoot pulse, you take a laser beam, and so these are more costly techniques through which you try to create a variation in the environment which is manifested as fault. So now you have got a fault-free ciphertext, you have got a faulty ciphertext, you try to develop an analysis which will give you the key. That is basically the idea behind differential fault attack algorithms. So let me try to illustrate a DFA for AES algorithm. So for those who have seen the AES algorithm, you can see that, or even for those who have not seen, just imagine that AES is basically a bunch of repetitive operations which are being done. And suppose when you are doing the encryption operation, there is a fault which has been created due to some kind of injection technique. So the injection technique, and believe me, faults in complicated systems are more probable than not. Okay, so let me give a very simple example of how you can create a fault. So in a controlled manner. So suppose you have got a crypto engine and in a very clever manner, you try to suddenly change the clock and make the clock having a very fast frequency compared to what it can manage. And that change in the clock frequency can introduce a fault. Okay, and there may be other ways of injecting the fault, but imagine that suppose there is a fault which has been created in some manner in this kind of using some kind of injection technique, and now the fault can take any possible value, right? It's a random fault. But then if you observe the encryption algorithm, you will find that there is a definite mathematical way in which the encryption works. For example, there is a step which is a bijective transformation or a one-to-one transformation, which takes the fault and kind of maps it into some other fault value. And then again, there are following operations like so on. But at some point of time, if you observe this and trace this behavior of fault, you will see that, for example, at the output of the 9th round mixed column, that means essentially at this point, you will see that the internal bytes which are there in the state matrix, they have got very nice mathematical relationships. Okay, so imagine that, remember that I started with a random fault, but now that random fault has yielded me nice interrelationships among the fault values. Okay, so now the attacker will try to do a very clever trick. The attacker will try to guess the last round key and will try to revert back and go to this point, kind of invert back and go to this point and try to exploit these interrelationships. And that is essentially framed in the form of what are called as, like algebraic equations or maybe set solving equations, which an attacker would try to solve. Okay, so if you kind of believe me at this point, right, I mean, I can just give you a result which says that if you have just one single fault, then for AES 128, the total number of key size shrinks to only 256 values. That is around 2 power of 8 values. Okay, so so how many? So for example, like you can imagine that the power of this attack, because initially when you started the experiment, you had a 128-bit secret key. Okay, and therefore, right, it had 2 to the power of 128 possibilities. Suddenly, because of this fault, right, when I give you just one single faulty ciphertext, that key size shrinks to only 208, 2 to the power of 8 values. Okay, which is nothing. Okay, and if I just give you 2 faulty ciphertexts, then you can actually uniquely retrieve the secret key. So this attack in a real life system can work with less than 30 minutes, okay, which can give you the complete 128-bit secret key if there is somebody who gives you the faulty ciphertext. So this can have got tremendous impact on various kind of modern day systems. Okay. So in one of the case studies that we were observing, right, is and we saw that this is a paper which is published in FDTC, which is the premier conference on fault detection and tolerance, which showed a case study of what is called as an ASIL lead chip. Okay. So what is the abbreviation for ASIL or ASIL? ASIL stands for Automotive Security Integrity Level. Okay. So and probably we know nowadays, like our cars or automotives have become very complex, and more than mechanical, they are probably they have more lines of codes than probably there are in computing systems. Okay. So therefore, right, while safety was a major concern for this kind of automotive devices, and therefore there were standards like ISO 26262 and so on, people understood that safety is not equal to security. Okay. For security, you need to have dedicated techniques. In order to illustrate this point that safety and security are not the same, here is a case study which can be worthwhile to see. So we consider two chips here. One is called as an ASIL D1, and then we have got an ASIL D2 chip. So an ASIL D1, it basically implements an ARM Cortex core, okay, which is a very popular, manufacturing company. And there is another chip which basically implements what is called as a PowerPC E200. So in both these mechanisms, they are, like ASIL D. That means there is a level of redundancy which is being involved in them. So in this case, in both these targets, the mechanisms include a dual core CPU. That means there are two cores, and there is a simple time redundancy check which is being done. There is a comparison which is being done. And there is an error correction code which is also being a part of this design. Okay. So that means like you are doing a redundancy check, which means you are doing this computation twice, and you are seeing that whether the value is same in both the cases. And the belief is that, even if there is a fault, the chance that the two faults will be exactly same is very low. Okay. And that will probably eliminate, or this kind of fault tolerance or safety mechanism should be able to eliminate a fault which is being, a fault to be exploited by an adversary. But then here is an experiment. So you take maybe a couple of fault injection tools, one which is a simple voltage glitcher, which, as I said, remember that when you are fluctuating voltages, those who are, having an electronics, study will understand that when you're varying the voltage, then the voltage is varying essentially affects the delay of your underlying gates, okay, which are realizing your circuits. And that creates some kind of violations inside the circuit, which are called as, say, setup time violations, which are often manifested as faults. Likewise, you can also have maybe an electromagnetic glitching mechanism, which is a slightly more sophisticated device. But the idea being that you take an EM gun, you shoot the pulse, and that creates internal faults. Okay. So now if we take these two kind of fault injection tools and we repeat an experiment. So here is a couple of experiments which are being done. In experiment one, you basically have got some kind of assembly instructions of, incrementing a register and finally reporting the register value. Okay, so imagine that suppose you are doing, say, 50 such increments with one. So the correct value should be 50. So any deviation from 50 means the chip is still revealing a faulty output, which should not take place. In a second experiment, we do a simple authentication check. Okay, so the idea is that there is a chip and there is a secret key. So you basically do an authentication check. That means if the correct key is not properly input, then you kind of raise a flag down. So it should not reveal, it should not allow, an unauthenticated person to interact with the device. So what was done is a bunch of, 7,20,000 experiments with several glitches were injected on these two chips for around 3 weeks. Okay. And this is a kind of a summary of what was observed. For example, in the ASIL D1 chip, using voltage glitches, even with this kind of detection mechanism, 87% right, resulting in faulty output. So that means the detection mechanism was not able to kind of detect this kind of faults. In the second experiment, we found that in the authentication experiment, for example, it was found that 57% cases, right, the EM attack technique was able to violate and still divulge the faulty output. So a postmortem was done, and one of the possible guesses was that because of there being a three-stage pipeline in this implementation. So what was probably happening is that although there were two computations which are being done, but when you are injecting the fault either by the voltage or by the EM, then both the computations are getting affected in a similar manner, and therefore they are not being detected by the detection mechanism. But what is more important to understand, apart from the specific case in this case, is that although you had a mechanism, right, which was supposed to give you a safe result, the attacker was able to manipulate and still obtain faulty output, which can be utilized to get your secret key information. So this shows that although you have safety mechanism, the safety mechanism is for classical fault tolerance, which tries to kind of circumvent against natural faults, which are so when we talk about natural faults, then there is no bias, because typically nature has got no bias. It tries to kind of inject a fault which essentially is not is free from bias. But when we talk about security faults or faults with security concerns, then the attacker essentially has got his injection tool through which it can bias its fault injection technique. And what we have seen is that the probability of defeating such a system is directly proportional to the bias. So that means as you can increase the bias, you have got a bigger and bigger success rate of bypassing the detection mechanism and still extracting faulty output, which can be utilized to perform an attack. So let me try to give a demonstration of a setup that we have in this context, and just to kind of show. So I want to kind of stop here and kind of emphasize here. This is a fault injection setup. You can see that the correct value was 0x1f, but the 15, but the moment the EM gun was triggered, it basically created a fault which is 0x95. Again, when we will remove this effect, you can see that this value should revert back to the actual value. Right. So this was a small, I would say, like a demonstration on, like just to give a feel of a real life side channel setup. So with this, I come to the last part of my talk, which is on the lightweight authentication of devices using PUFs. So let me try to give, as we have already understood that the security and privacy is very important in the context of IoT. We have got the things to be implemented so that they are not subjected to side channel attacks. And likewise, right, we cannot often, because of the fact that they are often seriously resource constrained, we need lightweight solutions. So in this context, we try to look into what are called as puffs or physically unclonable functions, which are a very promising, I would say, like a hardware security primitive, and see how we can employ or engage them in the context of IoT. So for this, again, this is a case study of, again, of this, what we discussed, like the Philips Hue wireless lighting system, but from a different context. Like previously, I was talking about the side channel vulnerability of these systems, but now we will be quickly talking about the, their authentication mechanism. So initially, right, when we observed this, when this was observed, the authentication mechanism was essentially what can easily be circumvented in the fact that they have, their own authentication mechanism. So what was observed is that when the app was initially launched, the idea was that you take these smart bulbs, and the smart bulbs were authenticated by, or based on the computation of what is called as a hash or an MD5 hash being computed on the legitimate MAC addresses. So then an attacker who basically knows the MAC address of the device, which can easily be retrieved, then can just compute its MD5 hash and observe the corresponding username of the devices. So later on, this mechanism was changed, but it became even more worse. And the idea was that this was communicated then in the form of just plain text. So here is a simple experiment or attack that was tried out in our lab, which basically engages simple eavesdropping tools like Wireshark. So initially, when the username is created, at the time of registration, there is a whitelisting being done, and that whitelisting is done by just by generating a random number and by communicating that random number. So now, if you have got a like a Wireshark kind of like adversary tools, then you can pick up those signals or these values, and the username can be fetched. And then using the IP address of the breach and the username, the entire whitelist of the breach is exposed. So this shows that even like popular IoT systems, of course, later on this must be fixed, but it can have vulnerabilities even when they are being deployed in the market. So therefore, right, it is very important to understand or think about how we can develop proper authentication solutions so that these kind of attacks are prevented. So in this context, in our lab, we are trying to look into this hardware primitive, which is called as a puff. So the puff essentially is a very, in a very nutshell, it means that like it's a device-based fingerprint. The idea being that each chip essentially is unique, and it basically gives you some physically unclonable fingerprints. And the idea is that whether you can use these fingerprints to develop end-to-end authentication protocols. Of course, there are different challenges of designing puffs, like they have to be resistant against machine learning attacks and also has to be reliable. But assuming that you can construct such kind of puffs, the question is whether you can make good authentication protocols. So in a nutshell, a puff, right, if you just think as a black box, essentially is a challenge response mechanism in which the mapping between the input, which is often called as the challenge, and the response is essentially, I would say device intrinsic. That means if there are two puffs, and if I apply the same challenge to these two puffs, then the response of one of the puffs does not give me any knowledge about the response of the other puff. So they are statistically independent. So with this kind of, so this essentially has got its source in often in device physics, and the idea being that, like various kind of manifestations, like the variations in circuit and so on, are very intrinsic to that device, and every two device has got distinct properties which makes their responses independent and like unpredictable, even if you know the response of one of the devices. So here is again, like a very simple illustration of a puff. So if you take an FPGA device, for example, and you consider a simple ring oscillator circuit, and the ring oscillator is nothing but, as it is shown, as a simple digital circuit which has got an odd number of inverters which are being fed back, and there is an oscillation frequency in this ring oscillators. So if you take this ring oscillator and you kind of implement it in the FPGA, put it into the FPGA at different XY coordinates, you will find that the frequency is often varying, and the frequency variations, right? You can see that if I, for example, in this slide, you can see that there are 4 FPGAs. You will find out that there are slight variations of these oscillating frequencies, and these oscillating frequencies essentially, gives you something which is called the device unique behavior, and also give that leads to what is essentially a unique fingerprint of the device. So that means, like, if I give a challenge or input to this puff or to this device, it will give me a frequency, for example, which will give me a fingerprint which is unique to that device. So therefore, right, if you have got such a puff as a security primitive, then there are several advantages. It can reduce the cost, it can raise your security, because one of the biggest advantages of a classical puff design is that there are no secret keys. Okay, as we have already discussed, that when you have side channels and so on, then keeping the key inside even a secure non-volatile memory is often very difficult. In this case, in the context of puff, there is no secret key as such. The entire device operates as a secret, and therefore, right, gives you probably, quite high promises of security at a very low cost. Of course, there are several, like quality metrics for puffs. For example, as I said, it has to be unique. That means if I give you one of the, the response of, say, one device, it should not give you any information about the response of the other device. It should be uniform. That means the responses should be statistically nicely placed, and it should be reliable. That means even if I take the same puff and apply the input at different ambient conditions, it should be able to kind of, give you similar responses. Otherwise, even a legitimate authenticated person, right, will not be allowed into the system. So in classically, the puffs essentially are implemented in this manner. The puffs, so you take a puff and you try to kind of, authenticate using the puff. Then remember that you have a puff. Suppose you essentially have a device, authenticated device, which is housing a puff, and there is a verifier who, of course, cannot have the puff because the puff is unclonable, but rather it has got the input-output mapping of the puff. That is what we call as a challenge response table of the puff. So then what the verifier does is it gives you a challenge, and then you apply it to your puff, get the response, and you give it back. Now the verifier matches whether this response is legitimate by referring to its challenge response table. And if it is so, then the device is authenticated, and otherwise not. But remember, the attacker has also seen this challenge response mapping, which means that once you have used the challenge response pair, you cannot use it anymore. So therefore, you have to continuously remove those challenge responses, which also means that your challenge response set, or like space, has to be large. And also it implies that even if I give you the challenge and its corresponding response, it should not be like machine learnable. Otherwise, the attacker can develop its model and therefore can predict the legitimate response. So this is essentially a scenario in a naive authentication, but the problem, as you can see or probably anticipate, is that you need to store the CRP at some place, which can itself be targeted by adversaries. So in order to circumvent this, we try to come up with a technique where we try to kind of combine public key encryptions and develop a novel authentication mechanism for IoT-based authentications using puffs, where you do not need to store the CRP or the challenge response table in a nascent format in the verification end. So what we do is there are two phases in this protocol. There is an enrollment phase where you basically take your puff, which is your device, and you basically enroll it to a security credential generator. So what the security credential generator does is that it sends you a challenge. The device applies the challenge to its puff, derives a response, and the response is hashed by a cryptographic hash function, and that results in something which is called as PA. Likewise, if this device is tomorrow subjected or supposed to communicate with a verifier which has got a secret key. The verifier is assumed to have a secret key because the verifier is often, like a server or a larger computing base where it can afford to store a secret key. So then what the security credential generator does is it takes an input which is a CS, takes the corresponding decryption or corresponding key of the verifier, which the security credential generator does, applies or knows, applies a hash function and computes something which is called as PS. And then it applies an a technique by generating a random number A and applies an elliptic curve operation which is based on elliptic curve cryptography and derives the value which is called as B. So now this information is stored as a tuple, that is CA, which is the input which is being given, CS, which is the input which the verifier will also generate, and these two input secrets, that is A and B, these are not really secrets, but these are collectively this becomes a tuple, and it's stored in the pervasive cloud. So now note that since you are storing it in the cloud, you are not really bothered about the secrecy of this data. You just want to ensure that it is being stored in the cloud in a proper manner, so you can leverage the storage capability of the cloud, and therefore this should work pretty well. So now in the real verification phase, what is done is, suppose the verifier wants to authenticate this device, it basically fetches this tuple from the cloud, which is the CA, CS, A and B, and then uses its secret key KS and applies the hash function, gets the value of PS, again applies the reverse elliptic curve operation to get the value of PA. Now note that since only the verifier knows the secret key KS, the idea is that nobody else will be able to predict the value of PS, and hence will not be able to know the value of PA. And likewise, since the adversary does not have the PUF with itself, it also cannot obtain the value of the PA. So that means PA can only be predicted by knowing the secret key KS or by having possession of the PUF, which is assumed that only the verifier and the node essentially have got respectively. That means the node has got possession of the PUF and the verifier knows the secret key KS. So therefore now what the verifier does is obtains these values and creates an input which is called as QA and generates a verification tag which is called as VA by again applying some kind of public key primitive, which I'm not going in details, which is called as cryptographic pairings. And then it sends this input or information back to the node, and the node again replies back with VA dash. And the idea is that this VA dash should match with this value of VA, and if it matches, then the node is authenticated, else not. Now, in order to reply this value of VA dash in a correct manner, the node essentially has to know what is the corresponding response R1, which it can calculate because it has got possession of the PUF. So the PUF essentially means that when the moment it applies the challenge CA, it gets the response R1, but this R1 is not predictable by any adversary because the adversary does not have got a physical possession of the PUF, and the PUF being mathematically resistant to be cloned, and the idea is that no adversary should be able to develop a model for this PUF and therefore should not be able to get the value of R1 and hence successfully pass the verification step. So more details of this paper is there in this IEEE TDSC journal paper, which was published in 2017 and can be found also in an online e-print version of this work. So this was, implemented in a video surveillance camera, and where we try to kind of prevent against a replay attack. So you can imagine that suppose if you have got a video surveillance camera and there is an attacker which comes in and wants to, stream in a stale video set, then it can really create problems, right, in terms of the whole purpose for which the video surveillance camera is being engaged. So what we try to show is that now when we augment the video surveillance camera with the PUF, then the adversary cannot inject the stale data or stale video simply because it doesn't have the knowledge of the exact PUF which the video surveillance camera has been augmented with, and therefore, right, it is not able to authenticate as the video surveillance camera, and therefore its stale data is not allowed to be streamed in. So these are simple, and it is very lightweight in the sense that the entire authentication takes around 480 milliseconds to perform. I mean, if you take any classical crypto system, then it will probably take more latency if you are engaging a public key-based authentication mechanism. Likewise, the power consumption is also very less, which is around 0.044 watt. And so here is again, like a quick demonstration of this work. So let me quickly play it. So crack is basically a meet in the middle attack, and we again show that how the PUF authentication mechanism in IoT can help us to prevent against such attack vectors. So with this, this brings us to the concluding slide on my presentation today. So what we discuss is that security of IoT is of utmost importance in modern society. It requires expertise in several facets like security, embedded systems, VLSI architecture, networks, machine learning, and so on. In IoT, it gives us a very unique challenge in the fact that we have got on one hand the resource constrained things, whereas on the other hand, we have got pervasive clouds. I didn't get time to talk about cloud security in particular when we talk about authentication, encryptions, and so on. And there are several possibilities of explorations and research in this context. What we strive is to develop novel tools and solutions for side channel security designing new hardware primitives for an end-to-end IoT security. Now, what is very important is to keep in mind that a chain is no stronger than its weakest link. So if you have got, because of this heterogeneous nature of IoT, if there is a one chain which is weak, then the attacker will always try to exploit that weak chain or weak link. So I would like to conclude, but before I conclude, here are a couple of announcements that I would like to make. So at IIT Kharagpur, we are always looking for promising, like students who are interested to join our PhDs and projects. So here is the website corresponding to that. For example, there is one application deadline just immediately in 11th of August, which is on talking about cloud security. There is a very important problem in cloud security, which is efficient and secure searchable encryption. So we are looking for a couple of good candidates for that. So if you're interested, then please drop an online application into this. And likewise, I would also like to take your attention to this conference that we do annually in India. This time we planned in Calcutta, but because of the COVID situation, this will be virtually done. This is done with along with International Association for Cryptologic Research. And there are very interesting talks. More importantly, there is a deadline just ahead. So here are some topics that we work on. You can get into the website, and of course, the website is just at the beginning, at the below part of the slide. And the deadline is on 7th August. So if you are interested, it probably will extend it by a week as well. If you are interested, please shoot in a paper, submit a paper. And the good papers are not only accepted in this conference, which are published in lecture notes in computer science in Springard, but also extended papers are invited in the Journal of Hardware and System Security, which is also published by Springer. And it will be co-located with another event, which is called as Asian Host, which also we are organizing again virtually. We again planned in Calcutta, but unfortunately, it will also be done virtually. And here are some very good keynote talks and also invited talks which are in pipeline. So if you are interested and if you join the program, then you would also get to listen to them and learn. So also I would like to announce, probably many of you know, but still I have a like online, because I didn't get much time to talk in depth. But if you're interested in hardware security, then there's a 60 lecture course on hardware security offered on NPTEL, which you can have a look. And finally, I would like you to also take your attention to this workshop, which is just this month in August 26 to 27. There is the first kind of workshop on machine learning and hardware security. So the URL is also given over there, which you can try to register and also attend. So there will be very interesting talks. I will be one of the speakers, but there will be many other interesting talks in the pipeline. So with this, thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any queries.
Thank you very much, Professor Devdi Mukhopadhyay, for your nice and illuminating speech. So now I'll call upon our co-organizer, Dr. Kaushik Mujumdar, for reading out the questions.
Okay, so now we'll go ahead and take the questions. As I can see, there are a few questions.
Sure.
So the first one is from Dr. Shubhana Vishal. The question is, how secret sharing is done among the IoT devices?
Okay.
How secret sharing is done among the IoT devices?
Okay. So the idea, I mean, of course, like when we talk about IoT devices, right? I mean, IoT devices are pretty heterogeneous. So there can be different ways in which one can, implement their crypto systems in the IoT devices. The technique that I was trying to talk about was by using certain hardware primitives, like what is called as PUF, or physically unclonable function. So imagine that we have got an IoT device, and the IoT device is implanted with a PUF. Okay, so the PUF is basically kind of a fingerprint of that device. So that means if the verifier basically asks an input challenge, then the PUF responds, or the device responds with a digital value which is unique to that device. Okay. So now the question is, like, you want to do a secret sharing, which means that suppose I'm I mean, when you're talking about secret sharing, right? I mean, I believe that, are you talking about key management, or are you talking about like classic secret sharing among IoT devices? Like you have got a secret data and you would like to kind of distribute the data among those IoT devices, like maybe a bunch of end devices. So are you talking about secret sharing in the context of threshold schemes? I mean, the question is not very clear actually. I mean,
Yeah, as I can see, this question is short. So I
So-
think the question is regarding the secret key sharing or maybe like that.
okay, so what I was talking of in my talk or my presentation was mainly in the context of authentication and mainly in the context of generating a key through which two devices can communicate. Okay, but I guess the question is largely on, suppose you have got like maybe 10 devices and you would like to take a secret data and share among those devices, and the idea being that suppose out of them 5 devices combined, then they will be able to like retrieve the corresponding secret. So this is a classic example of what is called as a threshold scheme, right? So in that case, I would say that my talk really doesn't cover that aspect, but definitely, that is something that may be kind of looked into, but it is not something that, so when we talk about puffs, then the puffs largely, there are two objectives of the puff, okay? One is to generate a secret key, which is, intrinsic for that device. And the second objective is for authentication, like identity generation, because the puff is used for identity generation. Okay? But I mean, when you talk about secret sharing, then there are many secret sharing schemes. As you know, that classically there is this Shamid's scheme, for example. Okay, so which you can try to utilize, and whether you can essentially develop maybe a lightweight mechanism for secret sharing is something that needs to be looked into. But I cannot give an offhand answer on that.
Okay. So next question is from Atanu Ghosh. The question is, for power attacks, access or proximity to the device is needed. So if it is so, then how does someone attack a device deployed remotely?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So yes, you are correct that when you talk about the classical power side channel as it was developed, then you need a physical access to the device. Okay, but then there are several follow-ups of this work which also has been developed. So something you can search in the internet. There is something which are called as remote side channel attacks. Okay, so that means like you can do these power attacks in a remote manner. So of course you need to kind of like have a mechanism of monitoring the power consumption, so that so the idea is that the power consumption, you will be able to kind of get some kind of manifestation of the power consumption by doing a remote communication. Okay. On the other end, I would say that like you can also try to so when we talk about remote side channel attacks, then the remote side channel attacks are not restricted to only power attacks, but it could be maybe a combination of power attack, fault attack, or even microarchitectural attack. Okay, so that means like I didn't get the time to talk about, like for example, there are attacks like cache timing attacks and so on, which are actually done in a remote manner. So you can try to combine these attack vectors and come up with an encapsulation of attacks which can work even on a remote manner.
Okay.
Likewise, I would also like to say that, like when you talk about power attacks, then the techniques for doing power attacks are very similar to what are called as electromagnetic attacks. While in a power attack, you need exact power consumption of the device. In electromagnetic attacks, you can observe the, like electromagnetic field, and that can be, people have shown that, like that you can try to repeat and, so you can try to repeat the intensity, and you can try to do maybe a remote electromagnetic attack which can be done from a far distance. Okay, so there are few augmentations which people have tried through which you can do these side chain attacks from a fair amount of distance.
Okay. So next question is again from Atanu Ghosh. What if a device enclosed securely in an arrangement that does not allow or degrade the electromagnetic field? Additionally, we have a circuit, suppose, that modifies the power with a view to veil the power consumption. So what happens in that case?
Yeah, so so again, if I take the last part, there are, I think, a couple of points in this question. I think there are two parts in this question. So if I understand correctly, then the second part of the question talks about that what if there are additional circuits which basically tries to manipulate the power consumption and tries to make it statistically independent of the power consumption. So you are correct in one sense, like that people have tried to do that. There are various people who have tried to develop, like techniques for, like ensuring that the power consumption is static, and, like using some kind of on-chip compensators. People have tried to, so there is a very popular technique which is called as masking, which basically tries to mask the power consumption and try to make the power consumption, I would say, statistically independent from the secret data. But people have shown again, there are two negative effects that I can kind of mention here is that one is that many of these techniques are not really amenable to CAD technologies. Like suppose you want to develop a chip, right? There are some CAD methodologies which you typically engage, but since you are doing many on-chip modifications, then those are not really amenable to CAD techniques. So therefore, they're not suitable. Moreover, right, people have seen that they can be bypassed. That means even if you take or engage a very, I would say a complicated methodology, but because of several VLSI aspects like glitches inside the circuit and so on, people have shown that although you need more observations, but still you cannot prevent against side channel attacks. So you need more sophisticated techniques. Of course, there are such techniques which I didn't get the time to talk about. If you're interested, then you can take a look at my NPTEL slide. So there are techniques like threshold implementations and so on, which are more sound methodologies of ensuring that the side channel leakage doesn't reveal the secret information.
Okay. So next question is again from Shupana Bishesh. She has asked, which energy models are being used in IoT applications?
I am not aware of this because I think, again, this question is not really related to security, right? It is more on the energy prediction of the IoT devices, which unfortunately I'm not really the right person to talk about.
Okay. So the next question, I think you have already answered. This is from Shovik Dey. He wants to know the faults that you injected in the system. Are they permanent or temporary basis?
Very good question. So the faults that we injected in the system are mostly temporary faults. That means they come and go. They are there for a few split seconds and then they are not present. So that way, right? I mean, it becomes even more difficult to detect them because they are transient in nature.
And the last question, as I can see, is from Atanu Ghosh. The question is, what if the key is being changed in the device very frequently and at short random time? That is shorter time than the time taken for correlation power analysis. In that case, can this process work? And is that process is able to decrypt the key?
Okay, so of course, like I mean, if you are changing the key at a very faster rate, right? Then and then you can stop. So classically, right, there is something which is called as if you see any classic textbook in cryptography, there is a technique which is called as unicity distance, okay, which says that, okay, let me use the encryption say for 2 ciphers or 3 ciphers or so on. So if you basically use your or you change your secret key so fast that an attacker cannot retrieve the key within that time, then of course the attack technique will not work, right? Because you are changing the key faster compared to the adversary. But the problem is that these kind of systems are not deployable in real life, right? Because the whole point of developing, the fact that why we say that there is why we have practical cryptographic systems is that you would like to keep something as a session key, and the session key will at least be be there for a certain amount of time. So you typically do not like to vary the key within that time. So right, so you have to ensure that even if you are, so when you are developing secure systems, right, your objective is to develop a system which is practical, right, which is deployable. So you would like to kind of ensure that even if the key is not changed and is kind of still maintained, still the side channel information does not reveal information about the secret. But believe me, there are, I would also like to mention that depending upon the system, I would like to just stop with maybe this example. Like many of you have seen this, like when you take a car, right? When you open a car, you have got this key fobs, right? Which you just press to open the car and close the car and so on. So there is often a cipher inside. So there is a famous popular cipher which is called as keylock. So there are reported experiments on performing side chain attacks on keylock, which just requires one single power trace. Okay. So now if you tell that, okay, I have to change the key after every one time I use the key fob, right? Then that system will simply not be deployable.
Okay, so it looks like we have covered all the questions. Professor Mukhopadhyay, thank you for your nice explanations. And may I now request Dr. Shrikant Basu to give the vote of thanks and wrap the session. Very good.
Thank you, Dr. Kaushik Majumdar, for moderation and being the co-organizer. I thank Professor Mukhopadhyay for his illuminating talk and very nice presentation and his real life example. And he has shown us for our students as well to how to get it in IITs also for a project, for a collaborative work and other things. And we want to mention that after that we'll share the YouTube link over there, so you can see afterwards also his presentation. Somebody already asked for the presentation. So the presentation, if you see the YouTube link, so there you can go to the his presentation. So that's why, and we'll share the certificate link. There will be some questionnaires will be there, and after answering that one questionnaires, and you have to answer within half an hour. And so afterwards, you will be getting the e-certificate after 1 or 2 hours. And the discussion forum is important. If you are asking the discussion forum offline also, sir will answer the questions, answer to the questions offline. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, and our Honorable Vice Chancellor and our organizing team member, Mr. Mihir Singh, Mr. Subhanjan Sarkar, Rupali Patua, and especially our Prem Kumar and other members for the webinar team. Thank you very much. Thank you very much from our side, and thank you very much again, Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay. So spare the time from his busy schedule, though he's very busy nowadays. So thank you very much. Thank you very much from our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your kind.
Okay, so great. Thank you, everyone. This wraps up our session. So on behalf of the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad University of Technology, West Bengal, we thank you all for making time in your busy schedule to join us here this evening. It's been a pleasure to host this event. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope that we'll be seeing you very soon next time. So stay safe, stay well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Second, Basu sir, if you give the permission, we can share the links and we can.
Obviously, you share the link. Kindly share the link for them.
Yes.
So quiz link will be then. So kindly take a note on the quiz link. Dear participants, kindly take a note or take a snapshot on the quiz link.
Or you can do one thing. You can copy this entire thing into the and paste it in the chat window. As you did last day, just copy and paste it in the chat window and give some time for the participants.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Copy.
So I have put all the links in the chat box, sir.
Right. That will be it.
Somebody are asking for the feedback link. These are the feedback link, quiz and feedback link.
Yes, sir. Quiz and feedback link. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So somebody is asking still. So that's why So and the offline discussion forum and YouTube link also provided. And regarding sir, if you want to ask him questions, you are free to ask, and we'll forward the question to Professor Devdeep Mukhopadhyay. And after answering the quiz and feedback link, there you will get the certificate link, and you can get it now also. Yeah, certificate link, but it will be available after 2 hours. But kindly answer within half an hour the quiz.
Can I leave
Sir,
now?
for all the participants who were asking for the slides and PPT, they can watch the video as because all the PPTs are present in the video session of this lecture, and it is available in the YouTube.
Right. And you have already given the YouTube link, so it is.
Yes, a YouTube link has been given.
Right.
So all the lecture session video is available.
Fine. That's great.
You know that some problem occurred in my house, so I'll be leaving then.
Okay, Prem. we are
Yes, sir.
leaving
Yes, sir.
now.
Yes, sir. You can leave, sir. We will display this
So
link
you
for 2
close
minutes
it.
such that all
So my
participants
side,
can take the.
I am off. I'll be off for
Yes,
after.
sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Soikat sir.
Yes, sure. Sir.
Thank you, Manas sir. Yeah. Thank you very much.
মানুষ না সৈকত সৈকত সরকার
Okay, okay. अच्छा मानस आज के नहीं है अच्छा अच्छा ठीक है थैंक यू हाँ एवरीबॉडी
Thank you.
Thank you.
थैंक यू वेरी मच यस
Participants are requested to take the note of the link. We will be closing the session within 2 minutes. Either you can take the screenshot or you can note down the links, the quiz link, the certificate link, the discussion forum link, and obviously YouTube link for the video of this session. And for any question, you may ask in the discussion forum and our experts will be answering to your questions. For quiz, the quiz link will be open for half an hour and certificate will be provided after giving the quiz, and after 2 hours it will be uploaded there. And you can download the certificates